Awesome. All right, Jessica Abel, here today. For those of you who are watching or perhaps are listening to the audio of this later, if you don't know Jessica Abel, I'm super excited for you because you're about to discover somebody who I think is one of the most interesting people in the Venn diagram of people who are on the internet a lot and people who make art. There's that Venn diagram of those people, and I think Jessica Abel is just super awesome, super interesting. If I'm reading Jessica's formal bio, she is the chair of the illustration program at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, both within and without PAFA, the PAFA. Jessica helps creative people with big ideas get procrastination, to get past procrastination and anxiety, not get procrastination and anxiety, and get on with the making stuff, like getting past stuckness and get making stuff. But that doesn't even just begin to describe all of the neat stuff that Jessica and I are going to talk about today, the things that she's done. She has a graphic novel called La Perdida, which won the 2002 Best New Series Harvey Award. She's done several other graphic novels, including Trish Trash, Roller Girl of Mars, as well as 2 collections of stories from her omnibus comic book Art Babe. She and her husband, the cartoonist Matt Madden, were series editors for the Best American Comics from 2007 to 2013. And they've authored 2 textbooks about making comics, drawing words, and writing pictures, and the book Mastering Comics. Her book and podcast, Out on the Wire, is about how the best radio producers in the world use story to keep us listening. So in addition to being an illustrator and comic artist, she's a writer and a procrastination stopper.
I try.
Jessica, say hi to everybody.
Thanks for having me. This is really great to be here.
Absolutely. I'm excited. You and I have done a couple of things in the past. We've done some webinars together, so our audiences are maybe a little familiar with us. So I'm excited about being able to go deeper today and talk about idea debt and procrastination busting. So I just want to touch on the idea debt piece just to start with. In case people are not familiar with idea debt, I think you're a better person to introduce the idea than I am.
Okay. So idea debt is a concept that I was extremely familiar with, but didn't have a term for until I did an interview with Kazu Kibuishi, the author of Amulet, which is a great comic book series for kids, and among other things. And Kazu is sort of a big thinker about the creative process and so on. So I was interviewing him for Out on the Wire, my podcast, and he came out with this term, idea debt, which I found really compelling, basically immediately. It was like the analogy that he made, and that made it clear to me, is this the analogy of snowboarding for him. So he's a snowboarder, and he said basically when he goes snowboarding, he would be as he hit the sort of got to the jumps in the snowboarding park, he would see these young guys like hanging out there, kind of like studying the jumps as if they were about to like really, really do something awesome. And he would look at them and think, okay, number one, you're getting colder physically. You're getting less able to actually hit this jump. And number two, you're making it so big in your head that there's no way you could possibly achieve this. You couldn't make this work. You know, you're never going to get to the level that you want to get to. And so his philosophy became either hit the jump or pass it. You know, that's the only way to do it. Either hit it or pass it. And so to me, and he was talking about Amulet and how Amulet was like this enormous work for him. And if he'd realized how big it was going to be, and he'd thought about how big it was going to be, he never would have done it. He never would have started, and he'd rather just start. So essentially what he was talking about is perfectionism. The idea that if you concentrate on something in this way, then you're going to make it too big in your own mind, and you're going to potentially prevent yourself from ever starting because it's just so large and so overwhelming. And so basically you avoid thinking about it. You avoid thinking about the big picture completely. And I thought that was pretty smart. But the other thing that brought up for me that he didn't really talk about directly, but is what I've seen over and over again, is this idea of or pass it, you know? So he's talking about just hit it. And I'm talking about that's one side of it, but the other side of it or pass it. That there are all kinds of ideas that we hold on to, that we allow to weigh us down and that we carry with us like these, you know, enormous burdens for years and years and years. And there's no, you know, in some cases, those ideas don't even line up with what we want to do anymore. They don't represent who we are as artists anymore or as creative people. But we feel like we kind of owe it to ourselves. We kind of have to do it. And I think that's, you know, even if you aren't actually working on that at the time, it represents debt. It represents like a burden on your brain that you're sort of thinking you have to do this thing. And that weighs you down and keeps you from moving forward quickly on the thing that you're trying to do. Also, you may have multiple things you think you want to do all at the same time. And so you have, you know, a bunch of stuff you're trying to juggle, and therefore you don't really move on anything because you have all of these different things. All those are part of this idea debt concept.
Right.
And I think that was a really, when I had this term idea debt from Kazu, it was a way of crystallizing all of that into kind of one thing. And over time, I've sort of realized it's really two things. It's perfectionism, and it's also holding on to ideas that, and trying to work on ideas that are, they're not for now. You know, they may be for never, or they may be for some time in the future, but you really, really can't think about them right now. You need to put them away, like completely, get them out of your sort of field of vision. So, yeah.
I use Evernote as my second brain. I dump everything into Evernote as a note-taking tool. And I have a specific notebook in Evernote just for ideas that I may or may not work on at some point. And
which is great. But I would warn you that I've had those kinds of ideas, and then I'll actually have to, like, schedule looking through those ideas and going like, should I really put that? And then it's like still taking up your brain.
I don't schedule time to work through it, to look at them. They just go there, and then I never see them again.
It's fine if you never see them again, but you know, like if you're having a place to keep them so you don't feel anxiety about holding on to them like in a current way. But I mean, I've had projects that I've sort of intended to work on for 15 years.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of intend to work on them, and I'm constantly like, well, I kind of, you know, I should be doing this thing. I should be kind of, and that should is like a, you know, that's a red flag right there.
Yeah.
But you have to throw these things away. But I think that when you do kind of stumble on them again, I think taking a moment to just go like, okay, seriously, really, is this something I do intend to work on in the future? Mm-hmm. It's, you know, it's fine to have a holding pen, but the someday maybe piece of, you know, that comes from getting things done in that system can be really burdensome because it feels like you're failing, like you're not doing the thing you're supposed to be doing.
Oh, I think we may have lost the audio. Are
No,
you still there?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Hey, Thomas, and hey, Janet. Got a couple people from different places saying hi. So just giving a shout out to those of you who are watching live.
Hey, guys.
Janet says hello from Switzerland. I love that. I love seeing people from all over. So Jessica, give us a little bit. I don't think I've ever asked you, you know, in the various things we've done, tell me a little bit about how you got into making comics and illustrating.
Well, illustration was as a result of making comics. I did not start out as an illustrator, and have never been really primarily an illustrator. That's a thing that I've done sort of as like in parallel and sort of a sideline to comics. Mm-hmm. So I got into comics when I was in college. I had been reading them previous to that and just finding them really compelling as an art form. But I didn't start, it never occurred to me to actually try to make comics myself. Or virtually didn't, until I discovered the book Love and Rockets by the Hernandez brothers when I was a freshman in college. And the comics I'd encountered before, they were good, but we're talking mid 80s here, so we did not have the diversity of voices and approaches and all the other things that we have now. I mean, we were just really living in a golden age at the moment. So, you know, really great comics were things like The Dark Knight and Watchmen. Mouse, of course, was amazing and came out in like 85, 86, something like that. And so these things sort of started to broaden the discussion, but really it was like, it wasn't it was still kind of superhero stuff. And then there was Mouse, you know, and I had no interest in making superhero comics. And when I discovered Love and Rockets, it was like this really amazing. So especially the work of Jaime Hernandez, who's one of the two brothers who do this book. Both of them I really loved, but his I really sort of identified with, because it was really about like young punk rockers in LA living their lives, their relationships, the way that they, you know, the sort of the little dramas that happen around, and kind of big dramas that happen around them. It was very quotidian, extremely well drawn and extremely well written. You know, Jaime is still one of the #1 writers and storytellers in comics, I think, today. I mean, he's a master, but he's been a master, you know, he's gotten better, but he's been a master for a really long time. So I discovered that. And then suddenly it was like, oh, this is a thing you can do comics about. And it's gorgeous. And so I want to do that. And you can totally, I mean, my early comics is just like, you know, my interest in that just telegraphs straight through the art style and everything else. But so I started doing, I went to university, regular college, not to art school, and started doing comics basically on my own with sort of student clubs and things, and became editor of a student anthology of comics, and kind of went into mini comics from there.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. I think everybody I was the editor of a literary magazine when I was in college. I think those experiences of like being able to look at lots of different people's stuff gives you some good perspective.
Also, just the functionality of becoming a self-publisher, it was a lot easier to conceptualize doing that, having been the editor, where, you know, I did everything from, you know, getting ads and drawing them and page layout to, you know, selling it in the lobby of the building. You know, I did like everything.
Yes.
I probably could have asked for more help than I did. That was a lesson I did not learn for a really long time. But anyway, the point is, I knew kind of about functionally, how do you make a book? Functionally, how do you sell, you know, like at the most basic rudimentary level, how do you sell a book? Right. You know, all this kind of stuff. And so when I started self-publishing my comics, it didn't feel hard to do that.
Right. I think there's a lot of lessons, a lot of crossover to be had for like the indie self-publishers, the zines and comic artists who've been self-publishing. Like that's been a thing forever before. So before self-publishing became sort of a trendy thing like it is now. Or maybe it's not even trendy anymore. Now it's just a mainstream thing to self-publish. But you know, you and other comic artists have been self-publishing for a long time. What do you think are the things that other people who want to sell whatever their thing is can take away, can learn from those indie publishers and self-publishers?
You mean sort of in the early days?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so well, what can people take away? I guess a lot of lessons that I now sort of look back and learn, I forgot in the middle. You know, when I started having somebody else publish me, I sort of thought like, I'm done with that. I don't have to do that anymore. And so the thing that I did as a self-publisher was I knew I was responsible for my own success or failure, you know, and part of that was the quality of the work, obviously, and that's the thing everybody focuses on. But part of that also was, you know, I had a list. I had a mailing list. If only I had, you know, actually kept that from like 1992 on, you know, I'd be in an entirely different place right now. But like I had a physical mailing list. I would send out postcards with new, you know, when the new issue came out. There's a whole system of kind of like recommending each other's books that happened in. So it was called plugs, and so you'd have plugs in your book for other books, and other books would have them for you. And that is all pre-internet, so it's like a way of, it's a discovery engine essentially, and you can find now analogs of that, you know, now in the digital age, and sort of partnering up with people and being like in a crew. Like I was like other people, and so I would get interviewed, you know, with this group, or like reviewed, like here are the books by these people. And so there's that kind of thing as well. I mean, I think there's a ton you can take away from it. And we're in a much better position now in terms of being able to achieve much greater reach and publish at a much higher level, much more cheaply and more accessibly, and all those kinds of things like that. Just Kickstarter alone has like revolutionized the comics world in terms of self-publishing. Not to say it's easy, but it's way better than it was in terms of actually having income from this and actually making a go of it. but all that said, I think that the same things apply. You just kind of have to look for the analog digital, crossover essentially.
Yeah. The idea of having a tribe or a group that you run with, like you and I think we first encountered each other in Tara Gentili's co-commercial program, or maybe it was
that could be, yeah.
If we didn't first encounter there, it was we got to know each other a little better there. And that's just to plug Tara for a second. Like she has a program called Co-Commercial, which is a membership site for small business owners. And Jessica and I are both members over there, and that's how I first decided to invite her to do a webinar. Or maybe you invited me, I don't remember. Anyway, that's how we first started doing webinars together. And like that happens a lot inside of Co-Commercial. Like people who are members of that group find people that they resonate with and start promoting each other's stuff and helping each other and things like that. So
and interestingly, it crosses boundaries. And I think this is something else to sort of learn from that is, like, I'm doing a live event with Jacquette Timmons in a couple of weeks in New York, where I'm going to her dinner party. She's a financial behaviorist, she calls herself. So it's about like making the right decisions and sort of understanding how money works in your life and so on. And so she's in a totally different area. Like you and I, like there's some obvious crossover.
Right. Yeah.
We talk to the same kind of people. We do kind of slightly different things, but they're very complementary. So there's an obvious match up there. But there's all these other people in that group where, I mean, me and Jacquette, there's no like obvious crossover, but it's still about, for me, everything's about decision making and making these conscious decisions about what you're going to do with your work and how you're going to make it happen. And she's doing the exact same thing, but in terms of finances. So it's a really interesting way of finding that bridge and then building that tribe out.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I was trying to say is those who are listening, like a lot of our audience is young artists or early career artists who are trying to figure things out. Have a group of people that you can run with and have it not just be your other artists, right? Having it be financial advisors and other entrepreneurs and stuff like that. People who are doing different things than you will not only open your mind business-wise, but will also open you up artistically, because you'll discover things that are outside of your experience as an artist that will inform your work. That's been my experience anyway. I
absolutely agree with that. I think that the more richness you have in your network, the more you grow as a person and the more that you can grow your business into different directions and find new ways to kind of make connections.
Right.
I actually had this thing that I did back in the late 90s where I created the Art Babe Army. So Art Babe was my comic book, my omnibus comic book. And so that was my first mailing list. And again, like if only I'd held on to kept maintaining that throughout from 97 on. Again, we were a very different place, right? So when you build a tribe, I built it several times and let it fall apart. So hold on to it. But we had secret handshakes, and I had a membership card, and there was I made it fun. I made it a fun thing to do. And I still run into people who are they'll do Art Babe Army reporting for duty, this kind of thing. And so I think that it can get overwhelming too. I'm right now this week teaching a little course about marketing essentially to a small group of people. And this is the thing I'm trying to help them understand is this can be fun. This is creative. It is creative work. It's think about how you can, looking for that bridge between me and Jacquette is an act of creativity. Thinking okay, and I talk about decision making. She talks about decision making. That's a Venn diagram. That's an overlap. And looking for that with the people you want to attract as well, I think is really, it's creative and fun.
Nice. So how did you go from scrappy, independent comic artist to chair of an illustration program at a university?
Well, I wouldn't call POF a university.
Not a university, but an
art college, small art college. Well, from this direction, the line looks like it's drawn with a ruler. It's directly straight. From the other direction, I mean, no idea, right? Like if you asked me at 22, like, how do I get there? I would have had no idea. Mm-hmm. So basically, I think the early part of the path was fairly clear in that I went from self-publishing, then I won a Xeric grant, which was an important grant for self-publishing in comics that existed up until fairly recently, and they closed it down because Kickstarter had basically taken the place functionally in the market of that. So I won that award, and that was I was, I think, only in the second year or something like that. So it was still like people would like announce it, and there'd be, so it was this kind of big moment for me. And then I went from that to publishing, using that grant money to publish sort of my first formally published solo comic book, which was, the last of my self-published art babes. And then I had been making contacts with Fantagraphics, people at Fantagraphics, which is the publishing company that published Love and Rockets, my favorite comic book, for years. And most of them had been, really interested in what I was doing and supportive. The publisher of Fantagraphics is this guy, Gary Groth. And I had been sending him my mini comics whenever they came out, which is not that often, granted. It was like once a year, twice a year, it was not like a ton of stuff. But like when he saw the Xeric issue, he was like, wow, this is, so great. You want to publish with us? Where have you been? And I'm like, just look through the files on your desk. Like so which is
knocking on your door for years, dude.
Yeah, exactly. Like your second in command has written articles about me, that's not actually, he's now his second in command, and I don't think it was articles. But anyway, he was really, people at the company were really supportive, but he just hadn't, didn't notice at all, which is to say, stick with it. Like if there's someplace you want to be, like keep going back. The fact that I didn't get any response from him at all did not mean that I was never going to get a response from him. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, he offered me the opportunity to publish with them. And so then I did a series of books that were series of Art Babe individual issues that they published, and then we collected both the self-published and the ones that they did into books at the end of those sort of cycles. And Fantagraphics at the time was kind of and still is, one of the major independent comics publishing houses, and so that affords a certain amount of access and visibility, just a little bit in this little corner of the world. But the people who pay attention to that then, like that, they can be people who are influential in that world. And so basically I went from that. I did my book La Perdida first in individual issues with Fantagraphics, and then did the collection with Pantheon. Mm-hmm. So that was my jump to like mainstream publishing. Mm-hmm. And that basically happened because I ran into my editor at a party, and she knew my books, and she's like, "Oh, can we publish them?" And I was like, "Yes, you can." And so,
okay, okay.
Yeah, sure, okay. And she, she was interested in the issues that, La Perdida deals with. It's a book about a young woman who moves to Mexico City. Has a Mexican father, but was raised very Anglo. And so, but she has this sort of fantasy version of what Mexico should be like for her, and like how it's going to, make her feel more true to herself and authentic and whatever to be Mexican. But then that puts these blinders on her. And so she misses all of the stuff that's going on around her and ends up getting into very deep trouble. And so all this sort of like stuff about Mexican and American relationships and like class issues and all that other stuff that goes into that book, Anjali Singh, my editor, was really interested in that kind of stuff. And Pantheon was at that time doing regularly, not with her, she did a few, but with a different editor, was doing a number of sort of high profile comics. And so it was sort of the beginning of that mainstream book publisher comics boom. And I was kind of like in there at the beginning because I already had this stuff done at Fantagraphics and was sort of visible there. And then that kind of led to other opportunities so Anjali was the first editor of the Best American Comics, the in-house editor of Best American Comics, at a new job. She had changed over, so she asked me and Matt to do that. We also met various other people. We were living in New York. We were teaching at the School of Visual Arts because we were cartoonists and known as cartoonists. Like all of it had to do with that cohort and having friends and like, being known within this group for doing stuff that was felt very under the radar, and yet it actually was quite effective in making these kinds of relationships. And so I met Mark Siegel, who is the editor of First Second Books, before he even conceived that idea completely, when he was an art director at, I believe, Simon and Schuster. And I can't even remember exactly what it was. It was because he was interested in French comics, I think, and he was translating stuff, and we wanted to like get the books that he was translating out more visibly or something like that. So we went to meet him in his office, and he sort of cold pitched us this idea for First Second. And so we became like involved in the very sort of early stages of that. And that's why then I published Life Sucks with him. I published Drawing Words and Writing Pictures and Mastering Comics, my textbook about comics, with him. And then all of that body of work meant that, and then I had also done this thing with Ira Glass because of being from Chicago back in '99, this book about how This American Life is Made. It was like a little comic book. And that meant that I could go back to him, and like I could go to big publishers and say like, look, I have this whole track record. And I have this book, Radio and Illustrated Guide. Let's do a new book. Let's do a new book about like what's happening in radio right now. Because this was just the birth of the podcast moment, and especially narrative podcasts as opposed to, interview podcasts. So I don't know, I just kind of rambled on a whole bunch there. But the whole point is that like all of these things kind of come back in circles. The older I get, the more I see how things I did in like the mid 90s come back to roost now, in a good way. Maybe in a bad way too sometimes, but mostly in a good way. And, you have this whole kind of like, my interest in storytelling stems from like having to make stories and thinking about that. But then it's also like working with Ira Glass on Radio and Illustrated Guide was like, oh, there are systems for stories. And then I was trying to write a novel, which I wrote, and it was like a terrible experience. But that was another like intense period of learning about story building and structure and so on. And that led to what I did in Mastering Comics and Drawing Words and Writing Pictures. And that led to Out on the Wire. And that led to, like doing workshops and talks about, so everything, all these threads come through. And I think one of the most important things people can do is try to get some distance on what they do and what they've done in their lives and find those threads, like find those things that tie things together in an unexpected way, where you think you know what your work is about, but do you really? Like it takes a long time to figure out like what you're really interested in and like what you really do.
Yeah, that's so like following your interests and following the things that continue to tug at you. I love that. So you mentioned like La Perdida is about this girl that moves to Mexico, but you've lived in Mexico and you've lived in France as well.
Yeah.
Right?
So I wrote La Perdida after I got back from Mexico. It's not about me. It's not it's not memoir at all, but it gave me a lot of information about various kinds of expats who live in Mexico, and also lots of sort of cultural information about what it's like to be in Mexico City, like what it's like to live there. I loved it, and I had a great time there, and there were no major crimes involved in my life. But I did, it gave me this rich experience that I was able to draw on to make this novel.
Mm-hmm. So how much time did you spend in Mexico?
It was 2 years.
2 years. And how much time in France?
4 years.
4 years. Okay. So you spent substantial amount of time living overseas. You mentioned like seeing expats and getting cultural information and stuff. Like how else has it informed your art making to live outside of the country where you grew up?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I probably don't know the extent to which it has. But I think that the very first thing that it did for me, and it continues to do for me, is give me an enormous amount of perspective on who I am as a human being and as an artist. Because, and I made this analogy actually in an article that I wrote on my blog, what I feel like is especially when you're an American, when you're part of the dominant culture in the world, especially if you're a white middle-class American like me, you can feel like the culture is like the water we swim in. It is for everybody, but even more so when you are in the dominant culture in the world. You see yourself everywhere. And this is one of the reasons why having diverse viewpoints and diverse characters represented in books is so important, because people who are not of that dominant culture don't see themselves reflected all the time. And it's really, really valuable to see yourself reflected and kind of understand stuff about yourself. But that's a sort of side note. And I would say that, like, I feel like even people who are non-white Americans don't realize how much they are of the dominant culture until they go somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. You go somewhere else and all of a sudden it's like you're a bas relief, you know, and you suddenly realize what you're attached to, like in the back, you know, like that giant hunk of granite that you're a part of. It can kind of sense all the way around you, and how those, you start to see how these cultural attitudes and sometimes privileged, sometimes not privileged, but the point is that it's, you know, the things that come from your culture, how they affect your behavior, how they affect your interaction with the world, by contrast with the people who are around you who don't have those same, you know, they have a different bas relief. They have something else behind them.
Yeah.
And so that, and as an artist, I feel like that understanding is incredibly valuable, especially as a narrative artist when you're trying to write stories about people. Like, you really have to be able to understand how your characters move within their culture and how their culture affects them in order to write them really well, you know, and also to be able to write diverse characters and people who are not of that culture. The only way you can do that is by recognizing what is that culture, you know, what's in it, and so what's out of it, and how do those things interact and have a relationship with each other. And so historically, before I moved abroad, I was already very interested in relationships and the way people are to each other, and how they interact and have these kinds of layers of meaning in the way that they speak or act towards, you know, physically, like, are in space towards each other. That's always been a strong interest of mine. But when I went abroad, I think that interest broadened for me and got more deeper. And I think that there's kind of a turning point with La Perdida, and that book and books after that. I've had this, like, very sort of pervasive interest in class in my work that comes, I think, from, class is the best word I can think of for it, but, like, it's not necessarily quite that, but, like, cultural difference, and, like, trying to communicate and have relationships across cultural and class boundaries, and, like, how does that work, and what does that mean? And if I talk about that, like, in a book review, you know, like book blurb or something, I would just, like, glaze over and go away. But actually, I find it fascinating, and I think most people probably do in practice, because that's what we're always trying to do in our lives is cross those sometimes what feel like impassable boundaries with other people. So I think that's the kind of biggest thing. But, you know, it's also really exposed me to so much work from, you know, different people in different languages. And, like, there's something so cool about, like, for a writer, knowing other languages well enough to speak them. Because I wouldn't say I'm, like, super fluent in either French or Spanish, but I'm very functional. Like, I'm totally willing to just, like, jump in and talk about anything, and, like, trying to figure out a way to express it, you know? But when you see how other people phrase things and how their language forms their thought process, because the form of the language, the words that are available, the approach to putting thoughts together affects how they think and what they think and what's available to them. And when you see that as a writer, that's like, even though I write only in English, it's a real light bulb moment where you go, oh, well, this is actually happening with us as well. So again, it's perspective, but on a different thing.
You know what I find so learning, let me finish my sentences. What I find fascinating when learning other languages, one of the things that I think is super interesting is the way the neutral sounds that people make when they are trying to figure out what to say next. So in English, we say right? But in Ireland, they speak English, but they come from a culture that speaks Gaelic, and they say when they're trying to, so where I might say they say and but in Mandarin it's completely different. In Mandarin it's nemo.
Yeah, in Mexican Spanish they say este, which means like this. So it's actually a word. Like is not a word, but it is a word. But, like,
nama is that in Mandarin. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Except they wouldn't say See, like,
Yeah.
I'm mixing my Mandarin and.
Yeah. No, learning those little tiny words that hook things together is like one of the biggest sort of triumph moments in being comfortable in another language. Like, what do you say when you walk into a room? What do you say when you leave? What do you say when somebody says something nice? Or, you know, like, what are all those little things? And then how also do you hook sentences together, like this idea of like, what are those little mini words that kind of fill space?
Yep. I'm going to Ireland, going back to Ireland in November, partially because I'm going to London for a conference, and that gives me an excuse to be there and go to Ireland. And partially because I'm working on a book, and I want to study Gaelic more intensively. I'm going to try to pick up a little more Gaelic while I'm there, and investigate a couple of Irish fairy tales that I want to incorporate into my book. So I'm super excited about that. And last time I was there, I went to a storytelling night where half of the stories ish were told in Gaelic. And that was super interesting, even though I only understand like phrases and words in Gaelic. It was super interesting to just see the way that their personas changed when they changed languages, right? And then they did a game where one person told a story in Gaelic, and the other person translated the story into English for the audience, and that was super hilarious. But yeah, like I love traveling and seeing the ways that cultures translate. One other story, and then we'll go back to you. But speaking of ways cultures translate, I was at a board game cafe in Chinatown in Paris. And at the board game cafe, they have food and stuff. You can order food. And so I ordered a cookies and cream milkshake and French fries. Which I don't know, like where I grew up in Utah, that is a very common thing to take your French fries and dip it in your shake and eat it.
Oh God. I can't imagine what the French would think of that.
Apparently that was not a thing for you, but where I grew up in Pleasant Grove, Utah, everybody did it. It was just normal. And so not only were the French disgusted by what we were doing, there were 7 of us playing a game called Seven Wonders. And it wasn't just French people, like because it was an English-speaking board game night, we had 7 people from like 4 different countries, 4 or 5 different countries there. And so I ordered it and started eating, and everybody was immediately grossed out.
I feel greater confidence in the human race now.
But well, this might depress you. They were all grossed out, and I said, "Don't knock it till you try it." So every single one of them ordered French fries and a shake, and we all sat there and ate French fries and milkshakes and played Seven Wonders.
Oh Lord.
So I love like those sorts of experiences. They're so incredibly unique and fun. And they inform the way that you make art and the way that you see the world. And I love it. So, next question back for you that I was going to ask you was,
so distracted now. I don't know if I can answer something.
Dorothea says, yes, that's gross. Fries dipped in milkshakes. That's gross. Oh, well, I'm disgusting. So, talk to me about your work with procrastination. Just tell me a little bit about tell everybody else a little bit about what you do there.
Well, I've been working on this idea of creative focus for the last 2 years, essentially. And obviously I've worked on my own creative focus a lot longer than that. And it took me a really long time to get to the point where I could just like get up in the morning and sit down to work, get stuff done, finish, like get projects finished on a schedule. But I got really good at it, and better than a lot of people do. So when it turned out that a lot of people in my audience were really struggling with that, I was like, oh, well, I can help with that. and so I started writing about it and running the Creative Focus workshop. And so I recently wrote a book about this idea called Growing Gills, how to find creative focus when you're drowning in your daily life. And what I realized when I put all of the things together that I'd written and thought about previously into a book form, where I was really kind of coming up with overarching threads, is that the core idea that I teach about this is this idea of conscious decision, that everything, the kind of work that we're trying to do that is so difficult to get done is the reason, one of the reasons, and I think the primary reason that it's so difficult, is that it's self-generated work. It comes completely from inside, and so there are all kinds of problems that emanate from that. So you've got the problem of sort of imposter syndrome, believing that you're not the right person to do this, and you can't do it. It's not, you don't have enough, like you are not enough to do this work. So that's one problem. And you also have the problem of not feeling like you can, like you deserve to prioritize that work and to do it in lieu of other stuff, because there's always other stuff. So how does that prioritization piece fit in there? And then there's another problem, which I kind of pinpointed late, really, in thinking about all this stuff, which is this idea of dilemma. And that's where the conscious decision thing really comes into place. So basically, whenever you make the decision to work on something, on some creative project that's self-generated and important to you, there are going to be other things that come up. There are other things that you have to make decisions about, to not do something, to spend money on it, to do, there are all different kinds of things that you're going to have to decide. And mostly we are not aware of any of those things. Like, you're just thinking like, why can't I get my butt in my chair and sit down and write my novel? It's the thing that I want to be doing. And instead you find yourself, folding the laundry, or, answering emails, or anything, really anything. And I think that what it comes down to is, like, you have not actually dealt with those decisions. You think you've decided to write your novel, but you haven't really decided to write your novel. Because you have to also decide not to do this and to take on this particular issue, this problem over here, and say like, okay, well, I know this is going to mean that I've got to, block out 60 minutes and I have to turn off my phone, and that means I'm not going to get notifications, and that means I'm going to feel lonely. And like, knowing that is actually the core issue. Feeling lonely is the core issue. And deciding like, okay, I can feel lonely for an hour. That's okay. I can do that. I will have it back afterwards. It's such a simple thing when you actually do it. And like, when you decide that, you're like, I'm being silly. Like, obviously it's 60 minutes. It's no big deal. And you can make that decision. But if you don't know that it's in there, you can't make the decision. And if you don't make the decision, you're going to be sitting there on your phone on social media instead, right? You're not going to write the novel.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of different pieces to it, and a lot of different ways that people come into this, and a lot of different ways, things that people struggle with. Like, some people it's more the sort of mindset issues of, I don't feel like I can handle this. And for some people, it's much more like just the organizational issues of like, how do I structure my time? Everybody's got all of those things to some degree. But, I do have people, like students coming into the Creative Focus workshop, and some of them are like, oh, well, I don't have any problem with like making lists and like organization, but I have this other thing. And it's fine, because like they're all, all of those pieces are there for, to different degrees for different people. So this idea we talked about earlier of idea debt is a super important one in getting over procrastination, because one of the ways you procrastinate is by doing work. So
productive procrastination, yeah.
But it's not productive. It's just procrastination by doing work. So like, I need to, what I really like, the most important thing for me to do is this project. I may not know that because I haven't actually gone through the process of deciding, but let's just pretend we in our godlike powers know that this is the most important thing. But then you end up like doing research on this other project, or doing, like getting out your notebooks for this other project, and sort of, getting all in order and getting ready to do something. Mm-hmm. And because you're flipping back and forth between things all the time, you never make progress on any of them. And so making that decision to have one single solitary creative goal at a time, which is not to say you can't have another one later, is one of the most powerful things I've found for people in getting over procrastination. Like, right. decide consciously you're going to have one thing you're working on. And every time you sit down to work, you're going to work on that one thing. And then you do it, and the doing it requires other kinds of decisions, requires some structure and some support, but it's something anybody can do. It's not superpowers to do this. Like once you kind of start making these decisions super consciously and implementing them, it's achievable by anybody. Everybody's like, oh, I'm so disorganized. I'm an artist. I'm right brain. Ugh, whatever, like
the lamest excuse ever.
I know. And it's completely not true. First of all, structurally this is not true. You just don't have the tools. You've never learned how to do it. Some people are going to have a little bit more natural inclination, hello, me, than others to be super organized about stuff, but anybody can do it within their powers.
If I can get organized, anybody can get organized. I am the world's least organized person. I'm really lucky that I married my wife because she's more like you. She's pretty good at structure and all that stuff. Me, no.
But once you get the structure, you can implement it, right? Like once you figure out what it is, and that's what we do in our workshop. As it's also in the book and Growing Gills, but like in the workshop, we do that with support. So it's like people are helping each other make this decision, like what is the right one goal? And it just feels like this enormous decision, which there really doesn't have to be. It could be 6 weeks and you could switch. It could be a week and you switch, like when you finish, you switch. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be forever, but it feels like, oh my God, how can I put this thing aside that has been like in my mind forever? And then you go on to the next thing and you need, you need to figure out, mindset issues. You need to figure out an actual system. You need to break down your projects into small bits. You need to not focus on the big project, but on the small bits. Mm-hmm. So there are all these different things, and having that, again, like we were talking earlier, like having a team, like having a cohort, having people who are there supporting you going through this stuff is not essential, but incredibly helpful, and will totally like accelerate the speed with which you can implement all these things.
Yeah. I feel like, this idea of creating work patterns for yourself and understanding priorities and all that kind of stuff is sort of problems that are endemic to creative work versus knowledge work or manual labor or other things like that. Like, I think that in America, at least, and this is me just sort of wildly speculating, I want to know what you think. There is a body of knowledge that we have about how to do labor work or knowledge work pretty well. But as the American economy shifts to a primarily creative workforce, where a lot of the repetitive tasks are either automated or outsourced, I feel like we are not ready as a culture to support large groups of people doing creative work. So I'll stop there. Would you have any thoughts on that?
We're not, as a culture, we don't want to support people doing creative work, or we don't have,
maybe not that we don't want to, that we're not good at it. Like we don't have the sort of cultural understanding of what it takes to do creative.
I don't think anybody does. And I would say actually knowledge work falls completely in this category. Anybody who's trying to like write a book or, create a course or create a business, do marketing, like whatever, if they have to sit down and do it like on the spot, that's creative work. You have to, like we talked about earlier, this, like the idea that marketing is creative as well. Like you have to be able to create space and time to focus on this project, get the project, bring the ideas in and kind of build them and do something with them. And if you're not doing it in the context of a team where there are all kinds of deadlines set already, you have a boss, hovering over you, waiting for the thing, all of that, you can still procrastinate. It can still be difficult, but if you're doing it on your own, that's when you really are kind of can flail, like much more so. I mean, I know people struggle with procrastination at their day jobs as well, but it's just less of an overall thing because they know they're going to get fired. There's a lot of motivation there.
Right.
And it's also like they're being paid and they're physically in a place, and so all of these other signs that are like, it's time to do this now. And that's just not the case. So I think really the distinction is, are you doing this on your own or virtually on your own, or is it motivated entirely by you, even if you're doing it with like a small team, if they're, behind you, or are you doing this within a teamwork structure that's fairly organized for you.
Right.
And those are the kind of two different things. And I think that we're trained throughout our lives, in school and, professional training, all these other things, to work in the latter case, where, the teacher says, this is what's due. You may or may not actually do the assignment ahead of time, but she certainly tells you when you should be working on it. Certainly gives you opportunities to hit milestones earlier. And those who are really successful at school learn how to do that. They learn how to pace out their work, and have these kind of, milestones by the teacher and so on. It's certainly built into, and regardless, you're going to finish it in 3 months because the semester's over. Like you're going to actually, you have to, finish in that sense. And then the second part of that is, when you go to work, you sort of go straight from school into work, and you have that transition directly. But no, there's no training at any point that handles how do you do this without anybody there watching you and without anybody waiting for anything. And I don't know that there's any culture where that does happen.
Yeah, I wonder if it's possible for us to create that at the cultural level, or if we just have to find like other creators, other self-motivated creators, and hold each other accountable or something like that. Dorothea LeBlanc says, sometimes I'll flop on the couch to look at Facebook and get stuck for 2 hours. She asks, I think she's asking you, Jessica, is your solution for me to decide consciously to do what I'm doing? Like it's okay to be on Facebook and Instagram for 2 hours? What's the solution to,
Yeah, absolutely. Like if that's what your choice is, make it your choice, and then you don't have to feel weird about it. Like, absolutely, that's the solution. I mean, if what you decide is like, no, what I actually would rather be doing is this other thing, whatever the work is, then you decide that. But you're like, okay, and that means I'm not going to be on the couch for 2 hours, on Facebook. Like, that's a sacrifice you need to make. But what you try to do is you make that decision ahead of time, not in the moment. In the moment is too hard. You make it like the day before, the week before, and you say like, this is going to be the time that I do this. You kind of set the table for yourself. And when you sit down, you're ready to eat. So, but when, people need breaks, and like, there's nothing wrong inherently with social media. There's nothing wrong with, I'm absolutely in favor of having fun and like hanging out with your family and friends. And I'm in favor of all that stuff. But when you run into trouble is when you're like spending time, at a family event, and you're thinking the whole time like, God damn it, I should be working on my novel, and when you're working on your novel, you're like, oh my God, all I want to do is go out with my friends, like you have to be where you are, so when you're taking time off, like thing I teach about scheduling is like, you start with your calendar, you start with your time off. Well, you start with time that you already have committed, sleeping, eating, blah, blah, blah. The first thing you put on there in terms of allocating your other time is when you're not working. And get that in there so you have time when you're not working. When, that you're permitted to spend whatever time, permitted by you, by the way, to spend whatever time you want watching Netflix or whatever it is, going out with people. Then you look at what time is left over. And if you need to make compromises about that, you're like, okay, I'm spending too much time hanging out. Then you have to think about like, okay, well, what's my best use of my time here?
I like it. I love it. By the way, Helena Kuttner-Glasson says she bought your book and is working her way through it. So
awesome. Yeah. I'm really happy to hear that.
And Michelle Levon says fries in milkshakes are the best. So I am not the only American.
I would eat fries and drink a milkshake at the same time, but I would not put the fries into the milkshake.
Just
that is the difference
and
between
eat
you
it.
And me.
That's all. Jessica, if people want to find out more about you or get your book or follow up with your workshops, where would they go?
I have just jessicaabel.com, JESSICAABEL.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I love your wisdom and the way that you think about ideas and procrastination and art and illustration, and comics. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thanks, Corey. Absolutely. It was a pleasure.